So after 3 long years of waiting, one of my most anticipated games of the decade has finally come out, and it's easily my game of the year. But before we get further into this, a quick disclaimer. So, when I say that Death Stranding is my game of the year, I'm not saying that it's objectively the best game of the year, because I know that this game has been extremely divisive. A lot of people absolutely love it, a lot of people absolutely hate it. And really, it's just the game that left the biggest impact on me and the game that I enjoyed the most this year. So keep that in mind. I want to start by talking about my favorite aspect of Death Stranding, which is the story. So in Death Stranding, you play as Sam Porter Bridges, who is a porter, which is basically like a futuristic delivery man, and he lives in a post apocalyptic America that was torn apart by this huge event called the Death Stranding. Your goal is to reconnect a fractured America by delivering supplies and connecting different locations with the chiral network so that America can be whole again. I won't talk too much more about the story because I feel like it's the kind of game that you want to go in knowing very little about the plot because there's lots of crazy twists and turns that will definitely surprise you, and it's one of the most fascinating and emotional storylines I've ever experienced in a game. It has some of the most interesting and likable characters I've ever seen in a game, and there's literally one part towards the end of the game that actually made me cry uncontrollably, which is very rare for any medium, and I'm not ashamed to admit that Death Stranding had that kind of impact on me. One complaint I do have about the story, though, is the pacing, especially towards the end. Now, I feel like the last 4 or 5 hours of the game were definitely the best and most memorable. There were so many incredible scenes, so many twists, so many emotional moments, but I feel like they all get stacked on top of each other, and it got kind of tiring for me because there were several times where I felt like the game was going to end, but then it turned out there were like 2 more hours of gameplay and cutscenes, but until I actually reached the conclusion. And I feel like with a couple rewrites, they could have easily put some of these scenes a little bit further apart so that's not quite as tiring and it's not quite as much to handle all at once. I felt like the middle of the game was a little weak because there are a lot of missions that you do that get kind of repetitive and they don't really contribute that much to the story. So I feel like they could have cut some of them out and we could have had a more evenly paced story, or they could have added some of the scenes into those missions somehow. But once I finally finished the game, I was ultimately very satisfied with where they chose to end the story. I just feel like the pacing was a little much at times, and I feel like it could have been handled a little bit better in that regard. And the presentation in this game is absolutely top notch. Some of the best graphics I've ever seen in a game, extremely well animated cutscenes, and some of the most incredible voice acting I've ever heard in a game. But now let's talk about what seems to be the most divisive aspect of Death Stranding, which is the gameplay. So, a lot of what you'll be doing in Death Stranding is walking or sometimes driving through this big open world where you have to deliver packages so that you can convince people to join the chiral network and reconnect America. Along the way, you'll encounter enemies like the mules, which are basically thieves that try to take your cargo, or you'll encounter BTs, which are ghost like monsters that randomly show up. And in both cases, you can either sneak past them or fight them head on by either punching them, doing stealth attacks, or by shooting them. And occasionally there are also boss fights, and sometimes you get sucked into this other world that's based off of multiple world wars, and you get to fight skeleton monsters. And I thought these segments were some of the most fun I had with the game, and I kind of wish that there were more parts like it. But like I said earlier, the majority of what you'll be doing is you'll get a set location where you need to deliver the package, and you know where it is, but you don't always necessarily know how to get there, so you have to try and figure that out. Like, you have to maneuver over mountains sometimes, or go through rivers. And if this doesn't sound fun to you, then I probably wouldn't recommend playing Death Stranding, although I definitely think that everybody should give it a try, but I don't want you to waste your money on a game that ultimately you won't enjoy. Personally, I actually found the gameplay loop to be pretty addicting in a weird way, and I had a lot of fun throughout most of the game. Although, like I said, the game kind of gets a bit repetitive in the middle of it, and a lot of those missions I feel could have been cut out because they don't even really contribute that much to the story anyway. And I feel like if we had gotten rid of some of those, then I think you would get to the action segments more quickly, and there would just be a much better pace to the game. I also just really loved the atmosphere of the open world. I love games with a great atmosphere to it, and something that's kind of unique about this game is that every now and then when you're walking through the open world, you'll hear these songs. Most of them are done by a band called Low Roar, and these songs really gave these what otherwise would be boring walking scenes, they gave them a very beautiful atmosphere to it and really made these moments stick out a lot more in my head, and it helped with some of the monotony. I also really like the combat, even though it's nothing revolutionary and it's pretty simple. You mostly just kind of shoot at the enemies or punch them or sneak around them, but I found it very satisfying, and I also found that whenever I delivered a package, whenever I finally made it to my goal, I got this really big, satisfying feeling, and it's hard to explain why. The way I've described the game, I'm not really sure if it sounds fun to you, but like I said earlier, if this just doesn't sound like your game, then it probably isn't, but I still highly recommend that you check out Death Stranding because it's one of my new favorite games and it's easily my game of the year.